a multi-decade trend toward work intensification. And work intensification could be being on too many Zoom calls in a day. It could be having to pick too many strawberries in an hour, right? Every job has its version of overly intensified work. If you're a fan of the TV show The Wire, how they keep talking about doing more with less, right? That's work intensification. And the interesting thing is that academic research can't quite pin down why it happened, which really fascinates me. About our working lives have just gotten quietly worse, again, across an array of jobs, all industries, all levels, for decades. Why did that happen? And that then raises the question, can we reverse it? Can we go in and actually de-intensify work? But then we're fighting this whole kind of cultural myth of like the VUCA, right? And we must be ever more productive. And, we're fighting a lot of cultural stories when we try to de-intensify work.
Welcome to the Warriors at Work show. This is Jeanie Coomber, your guide and host. This is a show for men and women in the workplace who want to move from the predictable to the potent. This is your weekly dose of inspiration with an edge. I talk with CEOs and shamans, sports marketing executives and therapists. All of us are like-minded thinkers and doers who tell stories, share wisdom, and challenge each other to have the best life possible inside and outside the office. Welcome to your Warrior Conversation.
Hey Warriors, it's Jeanie. Thank you so much for joining me here at Warriors at Work. Okay, you ready for a conversation about transformation, workplace transformation? Well, I had the opportunity of speaking to a very well-known thought leader on the subject on the future of work, Melissa Swift. Melissa is the U.S. transformation leader at Mercer, which is an organization that's all about redefining the world of work. Melissa is recognized for her expertise and has been quoted on the subject in Newsweek, Washington Post, Axios, Daily Mail, and has appeared on NPR and Al-Jazeera English. And we really broke down this conversation in a lot of different ways, but her capacity to draw upon research and data and marry it with words like empathy, compassion, and being more humanistic was absolutely fascinating. So all of you leaders out there, this is an incredible conversation to help you think about how you're leading, how you're growing, how you're evolving your teams, your functions, your organizations, and maybe even yourself, to think about what is the next iteration of the workplace going to look like. Enjoy. Melissa, thank you so much for being here with me at the Warriors at Work show. So excited to get into this conversation with you about the workplace.
I'm thrilled as well. My favorite topic.
So where I thought would be kind of fun is, obviously you're a seasoned thought leader. You're widely regarded as an expert on the human side of workplace transformation. And I'm just so fascinated, like, how did this become a thing for you? Where did this passion for workplace transformation come from?
So it's really interesting because I started off working on a different kind of transformations, right? I was in the ESG space for a while. And so, I've always been compelled by this question of, can we sort of marry up compassion and capitalism, right? Like, do these things have to be at odds with each other? I've never believed that they have to be in opposition. So working in the ESG space, think about it, you're asking companies to make some really fundamental changes to how they do business to create a sustainable way of doing business going forward. And my observation was, working in that space, what actually created the change? It was really the people side of organizations. And that's why some years ago I decided that's where my transformation focus needs to be, right? That's where we're actually going to create the change. And also, I think the part of me that's just drawn to big, complex problems, humans are the biggest, most complex problem out there, right? We're complicated and irrational, and we're not machines. And that's what makes it really fascinating to me to dive in and try and unpack and unravel this really gnarly set of issues.
Yeah. So tell us how, what's going on with an organization that would prompt them to say, I need Melissa, I need Mercer, I have to bring them in, I need to look at my workplace. What's going on?
Well, it's so interesting. When I was in the ESG space, we always talked about the worst possible outcome you could have through some sort of ESG failure was loss of license to operate, right? Like you can't do business anymore. Well, if you think about it, with the labor crisis, that's what organizations are facing today, right? If you can't solve that problem of not enough human workers to do certain kinds of work, that's it. You're going to go out of business. And it's generally it's that issue of we can't attract and retain and properly, sort of deploy and get the best value out of our people. It's this really fundamental kind of reset on that labor equation that leads folks to pick up the phone and call us.
So let's dive into that because, in the transformation space, you talked a lot about this with me when we were preparing for this, is using data and empathy to help organizations just reshape like how they're thinking, how they're operating, what their infrastructures are. So I'd love for you to just expand upon that.
Yeah, so I'll give a really concrete example. So there was some great research out of Stanford University that showed that up to 50 hours a week, people are productive. Between 50 and 55 hours, not so great. And people are basically unproductive after 55 hours a week. Now think about in how many professions do we work? It's not hard to work a 60-hour week. It's not hard to accidentally work a 65-hour week, And so but it's taking a step back and saying, okay, empathically, right? So the data is, look, here's the research, right? It shows there's this productivity fall off. And then the empathy is, okay, I'm going to take a step back. When I'm working that many hours, what gets lost in life? What gets lost in health? That's been one of the most interesting things we've seen come out of some of these experiments around the 4-day work week is people got more sleep.
I mean, that's funny when that happens, right? When you're like, wait a second, I got like 7 or 8 hours of sleep. I'm not foggy. I'm not cranky. I'm much more patient. I can make smarter decisions.
It's really foundational. And I always tell organizations, when you haven't slept enough, it's the same as coming to work drunk, cognitively, right? On a research-driven basis, it is exactly the same as coming to work drunk. So if you wouldn't want your employees to come to work intoxicated, don't let them come in with too little sleep. But then you have to ladder back. And again, that's the empathy piece. What are all the things you're doing that are causing them to not sleep?
So you're working with an organization, you've shown them the data, you're talking about this through the lens of empathy. How do you get organizations to truly shift and create more consciousness around what does this mean, empathy in an organization when you're making changes?
Yeah, so there's sort of two categories of things you can look at. Number one is obviously leaders' behavior. So you can train for empathy. You can give leaders strategies, checklists. Empathy is a teachable skill. You can also select leaders better for empathy. I think sometimes, unfortunately, we select against empathy. That when people display an unempathic way of working, we're like, oh, that's great. They're all about business, right? So stop doing that, right? Take that out of your succession planning. The other piece you can do is make it easier for the system to be empathic. So that might be, we shut down email on the weekends, or, we shut down entirely for the week between Christmas and New Year's. We create concrete guardrails. We do what a lot of organizations have done. Meetings are 25 or 50 minutes because your brain needs a break in between meetings, right? These are systemic things, and they don't rely on the empathy of an individual. And that's really powerful too.
Wow. Well, let's build on some of that because you shared some really fascinating statistics that I'd love for you to unpack. First, at any given moment, 28% of the workforce wants to quit.
Yeah. So that's from our Mercer research. That is like the long run norm over many decades. And that's really interesting. That changes your frame when you think about it that way. I think our assumption as leaders is often, okay, well, if these people are here, they want to be here. If you thought about it as I am doing an ongoing sales job, right? If I have to resell this organization to a third of my people every day because they're not buying it anymore, right? You might operate really differently. You might create a really different working environment. And it's interesting because our research also shows that everything else being held equal, tenure is a fantastic predictor of employee performance. Age isn't. That's what's interesting. Tenure is. So there's an incredible economic value, like forget empathy for a second, there's an economic value to holding on to the workers you already have. And if 28% of them want to quit all the time, right? What do you do things differently when you think that way?
Yeah. It takes the whole retention conversation to the next level. The other statistic that I thought was so interesting is 750,000 people die every year from working too long. And
Yeah.
is that something that you're noticing is a big uptick since COVID?
Yeah, I think what happened was we kind of like Icarus flew too close to the sun during COVID. There was a point when we were just working remember that we were working all the
Yeah,
time.
so true.
I mean, it was bananas because we had nothing else to do. And now we're seeing a real correction against that. And it's interesting because it's being called quiet quitting, but it might just be coming back to a sustainable way of working that doesn't burn us out. I think time will tell on that one.
Does burnout show up in some of your research? And if so, what's some of the conversations that are happening at organizations right now to deal with burnout?
Yeah, it's interesting because it shows up sometimes in some of these very banal, engagement survey items. Things like, I think the amount of work expected of me is appropriate. You get some really shocking scores to that, where a very small minority of your employee population believes that.
Mm.
And if you think about it, that's really kind of foundational, that once you believe fundamentally that you're overloaded, no wonder like 28% of people want to quit all the time. That there's been, and this really showed up in my research for my book, a multi-decade trend toward work intensification. And work intensification could be being on too many Zoom calls in a day. It could be having to pick too many strawberries in an hour, right? Every job has its version of overly intensified work. If you're a fan of the TV show The Wire, how they keep talking about doing more with less, right? That's work intensification. And the interesting thing is that academic research can't quite pin down why it happened, which really fascinates me. About our working lives have just gotten quietly worse, again, across an array of jobs, all industries, all levels for decades. Why did that happen? And that then raises the question, can we reverse it? Can we go in and actually de-intensify work? But then we're fighting this whole kind of cultural myth of like the VUCA, right? And we must be ever more productive. And, we're fighting a lot of cultural stories when we try to de-intensify work.
And it feels really big. It feels like a gigantic cultural overhaul to de-intensify work. Where would you begin without completely disrupting the way work flows and how we're productive and how we're making revenues and meeting expectations of customers? It feels really big and really, really scary. Like even the word intense is intense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
absolutely.
So I want to talk about your book because you have a new book coming out in 2023 called Work Here Now, Think Like a Human and Build a Powerhouse Workplace. And you're offering 100 practical strategies to get more of human future of work. I'd love for you to offer us just some of your best.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's like trying to pick among your children, right? All the strategies feel pretty good to me. But one of the strategies I really like is strategy number 2. So to the point we were just talking about don't take intensified work for granted and don't be afraid to de-intensify. I think that's a really fundamental step. Once we say work might be overly intensified, there's a whole set of decisions you might make differently if you were going to go back and be really intentional about how work gets done. Again, that's what happened during the pandemic is we gave work a lot of space, and it was like, okay, the water will expand as far as you let it. And so consciously saying, okay, work's intensified and I'm going to take things out. I mean, it actually, sort of relates to another strategy that I'm a fan of, which is strategy number 25, which is just do less. There's an ongoing conversation among, a lot of organizations around prioritization. That one of the things that's happened in the world of work is that we've kind of lost our ability to prioritize. The old Eisenhower urgent, important. everything's urgent, everything's important. It was once in a C-suite conversation where somebody yelled at the CEO, "We can't have 37 priorities." And it wasn't a funny statement. They had 37 priorities. Now, are 37 priorities actually priorities at all? No, that's just a list. And so there's a really fruitful conversation about what of the things that we do at work actually has an impact on the business results, and reestablishing that connection and using that to prioritize. Because again, it's not just about like, oh, we got to coddle our workers. It's about our workers are probably doing an array of tasks that don't actually affect the bottom line. And it's making them miserable, and it's not contributing to the business. And that's the sweet spot of every organization's got a lot of that stuff to really, cull out. And then finally, a strategy that I like is at team level, because some of the strategies are for organizations and some are things you can do with your own team. And it's about, as a leader, where are you encouraging work that doesn't really have an impact? Where are you encouraging performative work? And performative work's an interesting issue because it's got DEI implications. That a lot of times, it's the sort of loud guy in the meeting showing off, right? But there's no real business impact to, that performance. And where, as a leader, can you stop encouraging that? So it might be in the meeting saying, okay, that's great. I'm not sure what you're saying really is germane to this discussion. Let's hear from so-and-so that we haven't heard from yet. Could you move like that? But, we're saying, okay, I share the story in my book of one leader who would walk around at a certain hour at night and be like, I'm going home. I'm not working anymore, right? Which is so goofy. But that leader knew that his team was performatively sitting there because they felt like they couldn't leave until he left, right? So shut it down.
Oh my goodness. Melissa, like that right there is so important for anybody that's watching and listening right now. It really highlights that your team is following your lead.
Right.
And if you're sending emails and communication at 3:00 in the morning because you can't sleep, that's sending a message to them that they have to respond then as soon as they wake up. And you just reminded me of smiling. Earlier on in my career, I thought the way you get ahead is you put in a ridiculous amount of hours and you say yes to everything, you get everything done. And I remember I was often the first person there and the last one to leave. And I have to tell you, like when I reflect on it, I don't know what I really have to show for it, other than I got a lot of things done and I made a lot of people happy, but it didn't really amount to, I got promotions, but it didn't really amount to like a sense of fulfillment, a certain level of career evolution where I felt like I'm at a certain level now of ascension in my decision making. And the other thing that you touched on a little bit is I think the leadership conversation has to be different around this, because we have a lot of leaders in positions that are not equipped to do some of the things to even recognize that they're operating at that level, but secondly, to actually make any adjustments. How does that become a part of your narrative and what you're being asked to be a part of?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the big themes in my book and also, in my sort of professional practice, right, is creating a language for leaders to talk about how work gets done. In a weird way, talking about how we do work is the ultimate workplace taboo, right? Like if you say, I'm not sure we're doing this efficiently, or do we need 20 status meetings or blah, blah, right? That's not, it's not quite right to say that in a lot of workplaces. And so part of the purpose of my book was to give some language to, like intensified work that's been talked about in the academic community forever, but we don't often talk about it in professional practice. Performative work, we don't talk about in professional. Misunderstood work, where your boss doesn't understand the work you're doing.
Yes.
We don't talk about it a lot. So some of it is, let's have a language to talk about what bad work looks like, because until we can name it, we can't really fix it. And then creating a dialogue where it's okay for, if in some ways the ultimate work of leadership is to architect properly how work gets done. But we've kind of lost sight of that, and leadership gets involved in I mean, you want to talk about performative work. So much of leadership sometimes is performative work, and here I am in this meeting and here I am on that call and, the emails, great job, Bob, it doesn't have any impact. Whereas sitting down with your team and saying, what are 3 things we could do to be more efficient and to like get out of here an hour earlier, right? That's the real stuff. And again, that's the stuff that, putting empathy aside, that's the stuff that affects the economics, that affects the bottom line. When you really figure out how to do work better, everybody wins.
Even just asking your team, like, what would make us happier, more fulfilled with what we're doing and how we're doing this every day? I mean, talk about transformation, which let's talk about transformational leadership, because I read an article you wrote about the best 4 examples of transformational leadership. And I'd love for you to expand upon 2 of my favorites. First is my favorite word, a lack of perfectionism.
Yeah. So that again, this kind of comes back to the prioritization theme. That when we're perfectionists as leaders, we're, again, implicitly, there's no prioritization. There's no admission that certain things are just more important than others, because perfectionism is everything has to be right. And what that translates to is A, nothing is right. And B, it's a lot of incremental time between, sort of getting something done at the 80% level, which is generally good enough, and then all of that incremental time spent making it perfect, which, back to your point about a sense of purpose in your work, the time spent making things perfect, often for most personality types is not that rewarding. And it doesn't have a real impact, right? Unless you're, let's say in aerospace or something like that, where you really have to have a 0 defect outcome on certain things, right? But most work isn't like that. And the kind of perfectionist bent, and some of it is our relationship with technology. We believe today that we're at a level of technological enablement where we can make things perfect. Actually, technology kind of stinks, right? How many in your role? How many times do you have trouble with streaming technology?
Yeah.
There's a whole chapter in my book about the twisted and complicated relationship between humans and technology at work these days, because that there's that illusion of I can use technology to achieve perfection, but the reality is so far off of that. Important not to be a perfectionist leader.
Do you see a difference in gender around perfectionism in your work?
Yeah, I think it's tricky because women are more guilty of it, but we're socialized to be that way. I mean, I created a funny slide during the height of COVID, which showed a Zoom call, and the women on the Zoom call all looked like Disney princesses. They all went out and bought new makeup, retinol, ring lights, people got
jewelry,
right?
Yeah.
And the guys, so the women on the Zoom call were all Disney princesses, and the guys were literally like Yeti, like abominable snowmen, because they just all grew long beards and like didn't care anymore, right? And that shows there's a real difference in socialization. Once we were on camera all the time, we felt like we had to be perfect, and they didn't. And I'm not criticizing. I think we should all go in the Yeti direction, to be honest, and be authentic. It's funny. Our research actually shows that a high level of authenticity in leadership is really positively correlated with an energized employee experience. And again, that argues against perfectionism, that if you show yourself being imperfect, that's actually more fun for your employees.
Oh my God. Being human. I do a lot of work around executive presence and executive communication. And one of the things that I'll say is this is not about perfectionism. It's about being human. We don't want you to look like a Stepford wife. We want to see your edges and the dimensions of who you are. And actually, the more real you are, the more connected you are. And it makes things so much more efficient. You can accelerate ideas. You can create safer spaces for brainstorming. I mean, it's just, I'm so with you.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the other example of transformational leadership is this ability to contextualize.
Yeah. I think that one is critical because, again, and sometimes this is a function of technology and sometimes it's a function of too many priorities, e.g., no priorities. We lose the big picture pretty easily. And so that ability to step back and say, okay, what you're doing here on task level, this is how it relates to the broader business context and the broader world context. That's such an important leadership it's a storytelling skill. It's where do I fit into the narrative? Again, in our research, one of the things that showed as a sort of de-energizer was feeling like a cog in a machine. And context is what takes you out of that, right? It's not just like I am mechanically doing this thing and then I hand this task to this person. It's here's the story behind why I'm doing it. That gives such an incredible lift to your team when they get that context. But it means, by the way, you have to understand the context yourself, which many leaders don't want to admit they don't naturally. It means you have to go ask searching questions of the people you work with laterally, of your bosses, et cetera, et cetera. You have to go be a story finder, which is a tough challenge.
That could be a part of the questions that we're asking teams too, is so how can we be more happy, more fulfilled? Do we all understand the context and the meaning behind what we're doing and why we're doing it? And I think it would be interesting to talk about this notion of you have to take the time to offer the context, which sometimes is very difficult. We're operating very much in a transactional environment. We're moving from meeting to meeting, conversation to conversation. We're very focused on our efficiency. Can we do this in 10 minutes? How about 5 minutes? Can we make this in an email? And I think we lose sight of how important it is to say, do we all know why we're doing this and what the intention is long term? I think it's so, so important. It gives so much more meaning and like resonance to our experience here.
Absolutely. And that's something that, I think as, we ascribe a lot of these kind of things that have gone wrong to the Industrial Revolution, right? And that's one of those things that I think did go wrong at that particular juncture in history. Because if you think about an agrarian economy, they might have gotten some of the science wrong, but they basically knew why they were doing things, right? I know I'm planting at this time. I know why I'm, harvesting the crops at this time. Things made sense. And, so we need to figure out how to translate that to the information age, where increasingly, I think this is some of the deep anxiety and the deep fear is sometimes things don't make sense. Sometimes the context doesn't make sense. Sometimes the story is not there. And those are the really tough moments of, okay, I'm going to unpack it for my team. And when I realize I can't, maybe I have to do something differently.
And what if I unpack something that I don't believe in? Like then that's a whole nother podcast conversation.
Absolutely.
So a question I have for you is when you think about businesses, because leaders are listening to this, heads of HR, heads of talent. When you think about businesses as they're growing and evolving and they're looking at the future of work, what do you think they're missing or they need to think more about or plan for as they're considering what the next workplace 2.0 is going to look like?
Yeah, I think some of it is, what if, this is the question I see organizations struggling with the most right now, is what if the world has actually changed? That question is sort of at the root of a lot, that there's this wanting to believe if we just get back to normal. Well, when do we get back to normal? What is normal? I remember reading a great article about how the men who fought World War II came back and started, dating these women who they'd been on the home front. They wanted to go out and have fun. And these guys were literally shell shocked, right? They'd been traumatized by what they'd experienced. And neither group was wrong, right? Both groups had equally valid experiences. But there was they needed to have that mutual moment of here's how the world changed for me and here's how the world changed for me, and kind of reconcile their experiences. And it's really hard to have that moment of, I admit that the world actually changed. But I think we've gone through one of those shifts, and certainly from what we're seeing in our data, things are trending employees are trending in a less engaged direction, not a more engaged direction. So, we're back to normal. The New York City subway is packed again.
Yeah.
Right. And things didn't snap back to how they were before. So engaging with that question of, okay, if the world did change, what do we have to do differently? And that's really hard because we've set up these big, complex corporations that it's not so easy to just like, okay, just reroute to track 2. No, not a simple thing at all.
Yeah, and I think it's bigger than just saying, are we going to be hybrid or going to be in person? It's more how we think, how we team. What are we worried about? How do we create more delineation between our workday and our personal life? And what matters to me now that maybe wasn't as important in early 2020? I mean, are those some of the common questions that you're seeing organizations ask themselves?
Absolutely. And particularly, I want to center in on that question you just asked about how do we team? This question about what's the right collaboration model was sort of bubbling up even before COVID, because what had happened was there was a great emphasis on, and it was the right thing, collaboration within organizations. But what we got oftentimes wasn't genuine collaboration. So you see in the research of people like Rob Cross that certain people would become overloaded points in that collaboration network. And they would be doing the collaborative work of half the organization. You also saw a lot of consensus culture masquerading as collaboration. So, I just need all these people to superficially agree. That's not real collaboration. And real collaboration, by the way, I believe in the figure 8 model of get together, go away and think, come back together, go away and think, right? Collaboration is not everybody sitting on Zoom calls with each other all the time, right? It's not how any of this works. So that question of how do we team, those were the issues that were in the air before COVID. And then we got into, this piece about, do we do it virtually, do it in person? But I think the deeper issues, to your point, go a lot, or they're a lot more profound than just where do we collaborate? It's genuinely, how do we do this without all these emails? Do I need to have 5 different modes of communication going all the time? There's a piece about just how do people work together best that I think we haven't solved for.
Does COVID fatigue show up in any of your research? Because I mean, that's something that I'm just seeing, and people are talking about it very openly and honestly now. I mean, obviously the whole mental health conversation has afforded us a lot of opportunity here. And I'm just seeing that there's a COVID hangover. Yeah. And it's really affecting our cognitive ability, our patience. Like I said, I feel we're all different on a cellular level. And I was just curious how that has shown up in your research.
Yeah, absolutely. And at all levels of the organization too, that we've been attuned to it in terms of kind of frontline workers. But I think the interesting dynamic right now is that our leaders are COVID fatigued. And how are those feelings and those behaviors then cascading through the whole organization? I keep seeing articles on CEO burnout, and I think that's very true and very valid.
Well, it comes back to, as an organization is considering whatever their 2.0 is going to look like, everything we've talked about is more through the lens of how we're bringing the humanity back into work. And yes, you can look at the data and the metrics and try to build organizational structures based upon, business requirements. However, now with the human equation being paramount, it's really, really important that we think about how have we changed as human beings and what do we value now? I'd love for you to just, last question, look out 10 years into the future. Describe the workplace, like in Melissa's ideal world. If you had a wand and you can create the master universe of the workplace, what does it look like?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So in the last chapter of my book, I talk about kind of 3 interesting trends, right? That work is becoming more deconstructed, work is becoming more asynchronous, and work is becoming more transparent. So in that kind of a world, right, the way that all plays out is I have, I average worker, have more of the information I need at my fingertips, that there's not this dynamic of leaders maintaining power by having an information advantage, right? The information is flatter across the organization. I am better able to do the work I want to do at the right time. So that's the beauty of asynchronous working, is that, again, if we don't have to be in meetings all the time, people have really different circadian rhythms. So for instance, for me to get writing done, I really need to do it first thing in the morning. but people like to have 9 a.m. meetings. But somebody else might be fabulous at writing at 7 p.m. at night, right? So, but a more asynchronous way of working where we can kind of pass things back and forth in virtual space and communicate a lot of different ways, there's a better match of, sort of worker and work style. Really looking at kind of like, let's blow up the job description.
Amen. Amen to that.
Some serious problems. 60% of jobs in the United States require a college degree. Why? It's silliness. There's a lot of silliness in how jobs are put together today. So if we can kind of take them apart, maybe some things go into an internal, task board or whatever, and we pick up little projects and stuff. Again, this to me is what a better world of work would look like. But it would be kind of, be more asynchronous. It would be more transparent, and it would be more deconstructed.
Melissa, I'm so grateful that you are doing this work in the world. This has been such an enlightening conversation, so many great ideas, and I'm thrilled to see what happens when your book becomes public. Again, how work here now, think like a human and build a powerhouse workplace. Just so appreciative of your time, your energy, and this amazing conversation. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I love the work that you're doing here and the conversation that you're driving on an ongoing basis, I think is amazing and really contributes to the world of work. So I just appreciate the chance to be a part of it.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Warriors at Work show. If you are interested in learning more about what we do at the Warriors at Work show and platform, be sure to go over to my website, Jeanie Coomber, and subscribe to my monthly Warrior Playbook newsletter. I share everything that I'm up to month by month, as well as some lessons and insights that I've learned. I'm also interested in hearing any feedback you have about this conversation or future topics. So reach out to me directly on jc@jeanniecoomber.com or on LinkedIn. Be sure to tell your friends and your colleagues about this Warriors at Work conversation. Subscribe, review, and rate us. It's the best way to get this message out into the world. Be well.